Josh. I'm originally from the UK, but I'm currently living in Amsterdam. I've been a professional 3D artist for about 10 years now, specialize in product visualization. In my spare time, I also like to take on my own personal projects, like the one I did for the competition, but I also enjoy kind of like woodworking and making furniture, playing video games, playing with Lego, playing board games. After my submission last year, I decided that I wanted to do something that was quite different. I sort of already knew that I wanted to do something natural because, you know, a car is inherently very unnatural, and going sort of towards nature is really the opposite of what people might expect. I also really like macro photography and anything sort of to do with like the small scale details that you find in things. So I sort of was drawn towards the idea of doing insects, but originally I was thinking of doing maybe just a beetle or something, like sort of driving a wooden car with regular wheels. I was watching Planet Earth with my girlfriend, and they did a section on these Cuban racing painted snails. And it kind of, I don't know, just it sort of occurred to me that these snails had like racing stripes on them, you know, and all of these crazy colors and different shapes and things almost look like racing car decals. So that kind of sparked the idea that maybe I could use snails to power the car as such. And yeah, after I sort of came up with that, I started just sort of concepting some ideas for the chassis. I originally kind of wanted to use AI to kind of help me with this, but it was very difficult to get the AI to generate anything like this because there was sort of no references online of something like this image. So yeah, I started looking at sort of real buggy chassis and kind of tubular chassis that were used in motorsports and things like that. And yeah, then I quickly sort of concepted something in 3D Studio Max, just kind of drawing splines and things, and then coming up with the overall sort of dimensions for the car, and thinking how I could incorporate the snails into it in a way that's sort of quite natural. And then after that, I think I sort of, had to come up with a workflow to make it work. Because originally I was gonna sort of like go for a bit of a scavenger hunt in the local forests and find some sticks and then try and scan them and then try and deform them into the shape. But I thought, oh man, that's gonna be like a crazy amount of work. So I started looking into how I could do it in Houdini. And I mean, there's a huge amount of procedural modeling capabilities in that program. So I mean, I hadn't done it before, so I just thought, hey, this is going to be like a really good thing to dive into. I just started sort of playing with the ideas of how I could generate sticks from splines, and yeah, it sort of just evolved from there, really. The lighting in the scene is actually quite straightforward. There's only a physical sun, a HDRI of a forest, and then there's like a fill light on the right-hand side to just fill in some of the shadows. To be honest, like originally I didn't intend to go for this moonlit, foggy idea, but I was kind of, concepting some renders, and my girlfriend looked over my shoulder and she said, hey, you should make it foggy, that would be cool. And I was like, that would actually be really quite cool. So it sort of changed direction quite significantly towards the end, because I had this idea originally that it was just going to be this very sort of photoreal piece, but it would be so absurd that you obviously knew it wasn't a photo. But then midway through, it really didn't look that exciting. You know, it was kind of, again, quite sort of clinical, and it was such an absurd idea that I kind of felt like it needed more. So when she mentioned about the fog, I was like, I could really change the color palette here, go towards sort of a more blue lighting. And then I also had the idea of doing all of the glowing sort of spores and things in there as well to really just like add to the contrast. So I mean, a lot of that as well was done in post-production. I mean, there was an insane amount of this image came together in Nuke in the end, because what I was trying to achieve was really sort of pushing the limits of what I could achieve in a rendering engine. So I mean, when I do my work in my day job as well, we have sort of a pipeline that really sort of heavily relies on Nuke. So I already knew what I needed to get it there, you know? So when you look at the raw renders that came from Houdini, they really look significantly different to the end result. But I already kind of knew where I was going to go with it. So as long as I had the correct lighting information from sort of the sun and the HDR, and then I sort of did a load of different render passes for the lights and things, like I knew I could sort of combine that together and get this much more sort of mystical, magical look. This deviated pretty heavily in the middle of the project, because like I say, I just saw where it was going with the original idea, and it wasn't getting there, you know. So I decided to sort of change direction a bit. as I mentioned earlier, so it kind of came from watching Planet Earth, and when I saw these Cuban painted snails, it really sort of sparked like hey, this is really quite cool, you know, and it almost sort of resonated that these snails are kind of like, it reminded me of the old 90s show like Pimp My Ride, you know, they had all these just like crazy colors and things, and they were all totally unique. And I thought, this might be a cool thing to do, because then it's like a little bit of bling for the car almost. And the colors I knew would really work well in the image because they were just so vibrant. This kind of all stemmed from that. I also sort of figured that having snails as wheels also kind of eliminated the fact that I would have to come up with any sort of plausible steering mechanism on the car. It meant that I could keep the chassis really simple, because the snails would sort of like, you know, believably sort of go their own way and drive the car in a way, a little bit like a horse would. So it sort of all came together quite well, because it sort of made plausible sense to the imagination that these things could pull the car. But yeah, at the same time, I think it was like also kind of like a humorous take on things, that an animal that's known to be really slow was the kind of driving force behind something that looks like a racing car. I mean, it's a totally make-believe idea. So I really could just there was no limit to what I could do with it. You know, the only limit was my own imagination. Yeah, it did. I mean, the render, so it's not one render. It was like, I think it was about 8. So the sort of the main beauty render, I think I rendered this at 5K. And that took around about 12 hours, something like that. And then there was some of the other passes that rendered in like 30 minutes or something. But then when I was doing the volumetrics, that took really a long time. It was like three or 4 days rendering. So I also had to kind of account for that. And I mean, I did some test renders as well, because I also wanted to get the stuff in Nuke sorted out at the same time as I was doing the 3D stuff. So I was kind of doing like small renders, building a Nuke script for it, and kind of like deciding what else I would need from Houdini to make it look as good as I could do in Nuke. So I worked at like a quarter res in the beginning, just doing quick renders overnight and stuff like that. But then yeah, it kind of shocked me a little bit how long it was taking to do the full res render, because like you can usually estimate, but this really for the volumetric stuff really was excessive. And I was a bit concerned it wasn't going to render in time, but fortunately it was okay. The biggest challenge was really the memory usage. So, I mean, Houdini has like a fantastic instancing workflow, which is obviously very beneficial for me, but also the amount of textures that I was using was really sort of starting to fill up the memory when I started to render the images. And I think all of the textures that I was using were 8K. Yeah, I really had to optimize as much as I could and really try and streamline the bits and pieces. I had to compromise in places as well. Originally for the sticks on the buggy itself, I was using displacement, but I had to compromise and use a bump map for that. It's not a huge compromise, but to me it was still like a compromise, because I did sort of, you know, test renders in quite a high resolution of this buggy, and you could really see all of the wonderful details from the displacement map. And then when I changed it to a bump map, it really lost some of that. But I was thinking, well, I need it to render at the end of the day, so I have to do something about it. A lot of things where I had to kind of like start combining textures together as well. So for the buggy, again, I mean, the sticks were sort of like individually baked. Then I just ended up with like 36 8K textures. So I had to start like sort of separating bits into kind of like into sort of like a bundle, and then I would still bake them individually because it worked better that way. But then I would sort of like lay out the UVs in a loop in Houdini, so it could sort of like bake it to one texture in the end. So there was like a lot of backwards and forwards with things like that, which was a little bit concerning for me as well, because like I didn't really have a great deal of time to kind of fix these technical problems, but I still had to fix them, because otherwise I just wouldn't have got anything rendered in the end anyway. But I also got some advice as well from some of my colleagues on that, and one of the big things that they said to me was to, instead of rendering it in Houdini, I should just use V-Ray standalone, because Houdini itself is going to use memory when it's sort of building the geometry and caching things. But if I bake the whole scene out to a V-Ray file and then render it in V-Ray standalone, the memory usage is going to be much less. And it was significant. It was a huge amount of less memory that I used. Again, I had to sort of change the pipeline a bit to kind of start rendering in V-Ray standalone rather than Houdini, but it wasn't a huge change. It was, yeah, it was just sort of a scripting thing, to be honest, to just bake out the scene instead of rendering it in the program. That was actually a difficult part because it was a still image, and I did want it to look like it was fast, because that also kind of added to the humor of the image, that the snails are kind of moving really, really quickly. I experimented with a few things. Originally, I was kind of planning on putting motion blur on the image as well, but I mean, again, the memory thing was an issue because I didn't have enough memory to render the motion blur in the image. So I was kind of falling back to the fact that I could maybe do it in post, but it really didn't work very well in Nuke, and it also didn't look good. Even when I was just sort of concepting it, I was thinking it's such a shame to eliminate these details that I've worked so hard on. So I decided not to kind of do any motion blur in the end. But what I did instead was I kind of posed the car so it kind of looked like it was in a drift, because that's something that people associate with speed. And then I also kind of relied on sort of quite dramatic camera angles as well. So the camera's very low. It's quite a short lens as well. So you kind of get this sense of scale and this sense of speed. And I also kind of added some small details as well. Like there are some dust trails in the image as well. It's quite subtle. And there's also some like debris kind of flying off the snail as well, which does have a bit of motion blur on it. So I tried to get as much movement as I could into it, just with techniques that I could, but it wasn't an easy thing to do. I really enjoyed working on this project as well. This has definitely been one of my favorites, if not my favorite thing to work on, just because it kind of went reasonably smoothly, and it really came together in a good way. And it was kind of one of those projects that as I was working on it, I really was excited to see the end result myself, because things were going well during the process. It wasn't like I was questioning my own decisions or my own sanity at times. It really, every sort of step went really quite well, and it really motivated me to get to the finish line, because I was really excited myself to see how it was going to be. But in the past as well, like I'm fairly new to Houdini. I've only been using it for just over a year and a half. But sort of one of the first sort of personal projects I took on for that, which I didn't actually finish just yet because this competition came up, was I was sort of like making a Lego Star Wars kind of animation. And that I also really enjoyed, because I had to kind of come up with a way to build Lego geometry sort of based on an input file. So one of the things I wanted to do was make asteroids for the scene. So I kind of like made an algorithm in Houdini that would take sort of a piece of geometry that looked like a rock, and then turn it into Lego. So that was really fun, because it was a very different exercise to what I was used to. It wasn't 3D modeling in a traditional sense at all. It was kind of coming up with an algorithm to do what I wanted it to do. So I really liked that. It was like kind of working on a puzzle. Yeah, and then some of the things for that sequence as well were also very interesting. And a lot of the techniques I used in the Buggy Race too. So one of the things in Houdini that is a bit difficult to do is when you want to start using multiple lights. The lights are kind of done at an object level, so you can't copy them to points in a traditional way. So I had to write Python scripts to copy lights to points that I already had. And then you could interpret the attributes from the points and kind of drive the color and the intensity of the light. And I was doing that in the Star Wars thing because I was kind of making explosions and things that I wanted like these Lego pieces to be like glowing. So I had to kind of copy lights to points and sort of mimic the geometry. And then in this Buggy Race as well, the glowing spores were a very similar thing. It was just points that I would copy lights to, and then that would be used in the compositing to kind of get all these nice glowing effects. So yeah, I really like doing my own personal projects as well, because I just learn all this weird stuff that I would never do in like a current sort of in my job, because like I say, we have quite a sort of strict pipeline. So anything outside of that tends to rarely happen. But yeah, if you just work on your own stuff, you can do all these weird and wonderful creations and then learn a lot along the way. Yeah, I've always had a bit of an interest in photography, and specifically macro photography, because it sort of really interests me that a lot of the time people don't see all of these wonderful details that kind of appear in nature. I also follow quite a few people on Instagram just taking macro shots of mushrooms and things, and that was a huge sort of inspiration to me as well with this piece, is that something that's sort of so mundane and that we see every day actually contains all of this wonderful detail that no one is ever really exposed to. So that inspired me a lot, and that also kind of, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do something that was going to be very small scale, because you can kind of add all these details that people wouldn't normally think about. So yeah, in terms of the nature and the inspiration, the macro stuff was definitely a big factor. Yeah, if you have access to a cloud rendering service that can help out with things where you need it to, it can be a huge time saver, especially if you're a freelancer. Like, deadlines are again usually quite tight depending on what client you're working for. So yeah, it's going to be a massive help if you can sort of like push this out overnight to get done, and you know that it's going to be finished by the morning. Because yeah, when I was doing this, sometimes it took 3 days to bake all of the textures that I needed. So I think, as I mentioned before, AI is going to be a big one. I mean, the sort of Pandora's box is already open with that, and we're seeing some quite drastic changes to the industry already just because of this. I mean, few people are maybe worried that there's not going to be any jobs in the future. I don't really think that's going to be the case, because they're always going to need artists to do artwork. It's just going to depend on the tools that we use. But I mean, one of the major benefits that I can see at the moment is the fact that we're getting, like a new AI is being released almost every day. And there's a lot of them that can really be sort of beneficial to people who don't have much experience in a certain area, or they don't have time to sort of do like a really perfect job of something. Like you now have AI texturing services. Yeah, there's AI retopology stuff, things like that. Like it's all of this stuff that you could kind of consider very labor intensive. And I think, in my opinion, it's not so much of a creative task. So the AI can be used in a way that it allows the artist to be creative, and then we can sort of leave the technical things to the computers.